Hi, my name is Brenda Titus, and I'm a professional hypnotist in Orange County, California. For information about my program and in-person sessions, please feel free to go to my website, ochypnotherapy.com. So today's thoughts from the hypnosis office, I'm calling Good Fences Make Good Neighbors. Now, we're actually going to be talking about some metaphors having to do with having good, healthy boundaries in the form of fences. So, some of the inspiration for today's topic comes from the poem The Mending Wall by Robert Frost. And I actually read this poem during college, during one of my literature classes, and we really studied the idea of these two men that every spring they would go and meet up and walk the wall between their two properties and repair it. That's right. That was their job. Every spring, they would find the boulders, the rocks that had fallen, the places where there were gaps, and reassess and reevaluate their fence. And so, kind of the theory and the metaphor of the original purpose with this idea of good fences make good neighbors is that it actually provided an opportunity for the two neighbors to come together, to have a meeting, literally face-to-face opportunity. When you think about it, how often do we really do that even in today's society? So I like to use the phrase good fences make good neighbors to actually be aware of when we are talking about boundaries. And actually, it is important to acknowledge that in this poem, the two men are coming together. There is an expression of what the boundary is. There's a discussion, there's taking note, there's thinking about what this boundary, this fence, so to speak, means to each person. So let's talk about that a little bit. So the first part, it's not only about having a fence, a boundary is obviously the point of what we're talking about today, but it also is important that we acknowledge, because our boundaries that we have, whether it's our boundaries with our time, our energy, how we protect our peace, our and the boundaries that we have with other people, it is actually helpful to think about it like a fence, because otherwise the boundaries that we hold might not be clarified, might not be visible, and then actually aren't clarified or visible to the person who is having the boundaries put on them. And that actually can be very confusing. When we know what somebody expects of us, what the boundary is, then we know not to cross it, or we know that if we choose to cross it, actually, that then there may be a challenge. So the first part around why I like to think about fences when I think about the idea of having boundaries is specifically so that then we can kind of clarify in our own minds what the boundary is and why, and then we can define it, and then we can express and we can communicate it to whoever it is that needs to receive that boundary. So now I also like the idea that in this poem, The Mending Wall, they actually come together once a year and reevaluate, reassess, rebuild that wall. And so I think that that's kind of a neat thing. I mean, actually, I really like the title of the poem. It's called The Mending Wall. So by mending, and the idea, it's kind of a repair of the relationship between those neighbors. That's kind of how I see that within the poem. So the next thing, and it's actually in the poem as well, so it's a neat thing to talk about, is as we're setting boundaries and clarifying and expressing to other people, is to acknowledge for ourselves why this boundary exists. So first, when you think about, well, what is it that I am holding in? What am I protecting? So, and of course, when we're talking about a fence, we're talking about what we're protecting from getting out. Now, of course, when they're talking about the fence and the poem, of course, we'd be thinking about, we want to be sure that we're not letting the livestock get out or the children get out. But then when we can think about that in terms of maybe our relationships with other people, we might actually be overprotecting ourselves with too rigid a boundary and not really expressing ourselves, not really, being ourselves. So we're walled in. Now, I also think about that, as sometimes we wall in our emotions. And so, while boundaries are good and they can keep us safe, they also can limit us and hold us back. So then there's, of course, what am I keeping out when I'm having that boundary? And of course, we think about, if people are having, let's say, our boundaries with our work time, well, then what we're keeping out is all the, maybe negativity, maybe people, work. And so so that's why, like I said, when we think about the kind of boundaries that we're going to have and even how rigid they're going to be, that's, when we think about what am I holding in, what am I protecting, holding in, and am I being overprotective? And of course, then what am I keeping out? Because of course, what we're keeping out is also very important in terms of how we communicate with others. Now, the next thing that we want to think about when we're thinking about these fences in terms of boundaries is the idea of being fluid and flexible, and also being rigid and sturdy. So now, when we have a more fluid and flexible type of a boundary, you might want to think about, I thought about, well, what is a picket fence? First of all, it's usually a half a fence, a short fence. Maybe, I was thinking about a chain link fence, right? So there's something there, but it's also it's not as rigid and sturdy. Of course, when we think about when we really need to put big boundaries up, that's when we're talking about things like the cinder block wall. And I literally will help people during session even, and we'll talk about where they need to work on boundaries with other people. And we'll go through, okay, well, do we need to start with the cinder block wall? Is it 10 foot tall? Is it 6 feet tall? And what times can it be the picket fence? So it's kind of just a fun way to think about how we can use that imagery and use that idea when we are holding our boundaries, when we're establishing them, maintaining them, and also expressing them. And I'll share a funny story. So, when I go back to the Midwest and I would visit my grandparents as a child, and it was very surprising to me that they did not have fences in their backyards. And of course, where I live, we have fences. We are going to be very clear what our property is and where it extends to. So kind of a funny thing when you just think about, different places. But then once I was at somebody's house and they had a dog, and they actually had like an electric fence. And so the dog had a collar so that the dog would know where the boundary, where that fence was. But the people did not know. So it's kind of an interesting idea of an invisible fence and who was really being kept in that situation was the dog. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So I hope that this idea of how you can think about good fences, making good neighbors, and especially because when you can clarify what kind of fence you need for your neighbors, whether it's your friends, your family, your work, or something like that, something else, then you can actually build the proper fence to be a good neighbor so that you can still have good, healthy relationships. Because truly, when we can express our boundaries and express our needs and be clear with others, then they know what is acceptable behavior, what is acceptable, ways to get in and out. And so, like I said, the idea of communicating that is also a very important part of how we have boundaries. So with that, I wish you a wonderful week, and a wonderful week of exploring the idea of good fences being good neighbors, and have a wonderful day.